Russian and Ukrainian officials are in Turkey today for the first round of direct peace talks since the early days of the war. Vladimir Putin himself proposed the talks last Sunday, but he's declined to show up, despite President Zelenskyy offering to meet him in person. As a result, President Trump isn't there either. Well, let's speak to our international editor, Emma Murphy, who's in Kyiv. Emma, we've had numerous attempts at peace talks before. Is there any reason to think these will be more successful?
I think probably and sadly not. This has been something that's been massively discussed, these talks, over the past week since they were proposed by President Putin in the early hours of Sunday morning. But the reality is, for all the talk, I don't think there's going to be any big shift on the ground. It's been evident that there has been a degree of reticence by the Russians to really put forward their strongest negotiating team. Of course, President Zelenskyy says the only person that can negotiate on the part of Russia is President Putin. He's certainly not there. And the team that has gone, although seasoned and senior diplomats, they are not at the top level of Russian politics. So I think there is a sense, certainly on the Russian part, that this isn't something that they're massively committed to, although the Ukrainians are desperate to put out that image that they are there in force. The president is in Turkey, as are very senior Ukrainian politicians. So they might want something to happen, but the reality is, I think they and everybody else accepts that it is incredibly unlikely at this point.
And yet President Putin proposed the talks. What do you think his strategy is here?
Well, if we remember when he proposed those talks, it was just a few hours after the big summit here in Kyiv at the weekend, where we saw 4 world leaders joining with President Zelenskyy in person and more than 30 other world leaders joining online to bring together this so-called coalition of the willing. And as a result of that meeting, there was the proposal that was supported by the United States and in some ways proposed earlier in the month by the United States of this 30-day unconditional ceasefire. And the talk on Saturday was all about the fact that if that wasn't in place by Monday, there would be huge sanctions brought to bear on Russia. They were described by President Macron as not business as usual sanctions. And I think probably the proposal of the talks was a deliberate attempt by the Russian leader to try and sidestep all conversation about that ceasefire. And it seems to have actually worked really rather well. The ceasefire didn't come into place. The sanctions of yet haven't come into place. And there is no great pressure being brought to bear on the Russians, certainly not publicly and certainly not by the United States, to try and get around the table and actually have meaningful negotiations.
President Trump, as you say, is not going to be there. Do we have an idea of what the US is now pushing for in these talks?
Well, in a way, the US is only pushing in the background because these talks are being hosted by Turkey and they are direct, in theory, between Ukraine and Russia. And I think probably the US's position would be the same as others, which is that they want to see some form of peace. That's certainly the public position that they are taking. But they are not being particularly demonstrative when it comes to trying to force that peace. I think in terms of Ukraine, there is a very clear policy on where they want to go with these negotiations. They want to see a 30-day ceasefire put into place before any talks continue. And it will be interesting to see what happens when the negotiations actually get underway. Will it be that the Ukrainian delegation go in and ask whether or not there is the possibility of that ceasefire, and when they are told no, as likely they will be, they leave the talks? Or will they be willing to say, OK, we'll set aside our demand for that 30-day ceasefire and actually have these conversations despite not getting what we wanted, but because we really want to see peace in this whole process?
You're in Ukraine right now, where, of course, the missiles are still falling. What is the state of the war right now?
Well, overnight there were multiple drone attacks and also ballistic missile attacks on different parts of Ukrainian territory. And although the attacks on the cities are not quite as strong as they have been in previous weeks, we have had some quieter nights. The front line continues, and those cities and towns on the front line continue to take a real pounding. But you know, Russia are not actually making huge gains at the moment. They are making some incremental moves forward, but they aren't actually taking any big swathes of territory. However, they are building up in different parts of their front line, and there is a sense that they will try and push forward and take more land before they actually start to properly think about negotiating a peace. And in a way, why would they bother at the moment? They haven't got any great pressure on them to do that. And they are not in a position where they desperately need to. And until that shifts, I think there's very scant chance of any real change in the situation.
And what about the Ukrainian people who've endured years now of being bombarded? How would you characterize Ukrainian morale?
I think Ukrainian morale is still reasonably high. Every time you get something like we've seen this week in diplomatic manoeuvring, it seems to slightly raise the spirits and give a hope that, you know, this might be the moment that Ukraine can really make a smart move and have a big impact on the situation. They are very committed to this war in that they do not want to lose their territory. They do not want to have gone through what they've gone through since 2014 and more acutely since 2022 without some sense of success. But I think there is also a weariness in the population at large about this, how long it is going to go on, how big the losses are going to be. But that does not equate to wanting it to stop at all costs. And the Ukrainian people are still very much committed to trying to win this war, or at least come out of it with some sense of victory and not a sense of defeat.